You think evolution happened overnight. Darwin looked at a finch, scribbled natural selection, and changed the world. Wrong. The man who explained life itself spent 20 years collecting beetles, dissecting barnacles, and drowning seeds in salt water before he published a word. By the time he wrote Origin of Species in 1859, he had 5,436 specimens cataloged, 770 pages of diary entries, and a theory so dangerous he buried it in essays his wife kept locked away. What actually happened between the Galapagos and the breakthrough? How did a seasick theology student become the man who dethroned humanity from its pedestal? The breakthrough starts with a shell. January 1835, 3 years into the voyage, the Beagle drops anchor off Chile. Darwin scrambles ashore. He has been vomiting into buckets for most of the trip. On the beach, he finds a coconut-sized shell riddled with holes like buckshot. Under his microscope, inside one hole, sits a creature no larger than a grain of rice. He names it Mr. Arthrobalanus. Years later, this barnacle will consume 8 years of his life. But first, the voyage. December 27th, 1831. Plymouth Sound. Darwin boards HMS Beagle. He is 22. The ship is under 30 meters long, 8 meters wide, carrying 75 crew. 0 personal space. Captain Robert Fitzroy needs a gentleman companion who can also take field notes. Darwin's mentor, John Stevens Henslow, writes the letter. Fitzroy wants a man more as companion than collector. Would not take anyone, however good a naturalist, who is not recommended as a gentleman. The voyage is planned for 2 years. It will last nearly 5. Day 1 already breaks him. December 29th, 1831, Bay of Biscay. Darwin writes in his diary, "I have felt a good deal of nausea several times in the day. The misery far exceeds what a person would suppose, who had never been at sea more than a few days. The only thing my stomach will bear are biscuits and raisins, but the only sure thing is lying down." The crew celebrates Christmas by getting drunk. Ship logs for December 28th. Record punishment. John Bruce, 25 lashes for drunkenness, quarreling, and insolence. William Bruce disrated from able seaman to landsman for breaking leave, drunkenness and fighting. This is the floating prison Darwin will call home. January 1632. Tenerife in sight. Quarantine. Cholera in England means no landing. Darwin is tantalizingly near the town of Santa Cruz, but denied. He had dreamed of visiting Tenerife for a year. The Beagle sails on. February 1832. Brazil. Darwin steps into rainforest. His diary. "Here I first saw a tropical forest in all its sublime grandeur. I never experienced such intense delight." He explores inland. April 1832. 150-mile trek. He witnesses slaves being treated with cruelty that appalls him. September 1832. Argentina. Fossils. Darwin digs up bones from extinct giant mammals, ground sloths, glyptodons. His diary. "I have been wonderfully lucky with fossil bones. Some of the animals must have been of great dimensions. I'm almost sure that many of them are quite new." He notes something critical. These extinct South American creatures resemble the continent's living species more than species from other continents. Why would God create unique forms for South America, twice, once extinct, once living? July 1832. River Plate, Montevideo in rebellion. Darwin joins armed sailors to retake a rebel-held fort. At Bahia Blanca, Gauchos tell him about exterminating Pampas Indians. He meets General Juan Manuel de Rosas, commanding a villainous army in charge of eradicating natives. For a Cambridge graduate fresh from Christ's College, genocide on the frontier is disturbing. December 1832, Tierra del Fuego. The Beagle carries 3 Fuegian natives Captain Fitzroy had taken to England on a previous voyage. They return dressed, educated, Christian. Their relatives on shore seem to Darwin miserable, degraded savages. He no longer sees an unbridgeable gap between humans and animals. If you value documented evolutionary history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Darwin Correspondence Project at Cambridge University. Published June 2015, tracking all Darwin's letters and field notes, and the complete Darwin manuscripts at the American Museum of Natural History, digitized in 2012, showing every edit and crossing out in his original notebooks. Now back to the information. March 1833, Argentina. Darwin finds a new species of small rhea at Port Desire. The ship's crew has already eaten most of it before he realizes what they have. He frantically collects the partially gnawed bones. January 15, 1835, Chile. Mount Osorno erupts. Darwin watches the volcano from the deck. Forces that raise mountains become tangible. February 20, 1835, Valdivia, Chile. Darwin lies on a forest floor. The ground shakes. Earthquake. The violence destroys nearby Conception. Darwin notes the coast has risen several feet. He climbs 4,000 feet into the Andean foothills and marvels at the power needed to raise such mountains. In the Andes, at high altitude, he finds petrified trees similar to those at sea level. The mountains rose slowly and by little starts, in a long series of earthquakes. He is reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, Lyell's uniformitarianism, so the idea that slow processes acting over vast time built the Earth, gives Darwin a key to geological history. If geology works through gradual change over immense time, why not life? September to October 1835. Galapagos Islands, 600 miles west of Ecuador. Darwin spends 5 weeks on the islands. He observes giant tortoises. Spaniards can tell which island a tortoise came from by the shape of its shell. He collects mockingbirds. The birds on different islands are similar but distinctly different. He writes in his ornithological notes, "When I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. The only fact of a similar kind of which I am aware is the constant asserted difference between the wolf-like fox of East and West Falkland Islands. If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species." January 1836, Australia. Darwin marvels at marsupials. Why does Australia have a completely different set of mammals than any other continent? April 1836. Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean. Darwin already has his theory of coral reef formation. Reefs grow on sinking mountain rims, compensating for drowning land to remain within optimal conditions. At the Cape of Good Hope, he talks with astronomer Sir John Herschel, possibly about Lyell's gradual evolution and the mystery of mysteries, how fossil life changes over time. October 2nd, 1836. Beagle arrives back in England, Falmouth. Darwin writes, "I reached home late last night. My head is quite confused with so much delight. In 5 years he traveled the world. He spent 2/3 of his time on land, not at sea. He has 5,000 specimens, 1,750 pages of notes, 75 filled pocket notebooks, 12 catalogs. The vicarage has faded. The gun has given way to the notebook. He has problems enough to last a lifetime. But does he believe in evolution yet? Historians argue. The Galapagos passage suggests yes, but Darwin is cautious. He needs to be certain. Back in London, Darwin becomes a gentleman geologist. His father gives him £400 annually, enough to live on. He befriends Lyell. In January 1837, he presents findings to the Geological Society. He is made secretary by 1838. His diary from the Beagle is published in 1839 as Journal of Researches into the Geology and Natural History of the various countries visited by HMS Beagle. With a £1,000 Treasury grant obtained through Cambridge connections, he employs experts to describe his specimens. His Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle is published in 5 volumes from 1838 to 1843. Darwin's star rises. He is lionized in London, March 1837, 7 months after returning. Darwin opens Notebook B, first of his transmutation notebooks. He has become convinced that species change. On the inside cover, he writes his name and address in case he loses it. There is no evidence these notebooks are secret. He discusses evolution with very many naturalists over the next decades. But he is not ready to publish. July 1837 to February 1838. Notebook B. Darwin explores whether changes induced through sexual reproduction drive species evolution. Geographic isolation of changes, as on Galapagos, would lead to diversity. He draws a diagram, branching lines showing descent, often called the tree of life. It illustrates how existing and extinct species relate through branching descent. He reads voraciously. Leopold von Buch on Tristan da Cunha, only 25 flowering plant species, some resembling Cape flora, others South American. Why would God create species to deceive man? Von Buch states permanent varieties give rise to distinct species. Geographic isolation prevents interbreeding and allows conversion to new species. February 1838 to July 1838. Notebook C. Darwin continues filling pages. He considers transmutation from every angle, fossil records, breeding, variation. September 28th, 1838, the breakthrough. Darwin picks up Thomas Robert Malthus's essay on the principle of population, 6th edition, published 1826. He later writes in his autobiography, nearly 40 years after the fact. In October 1838, that is, 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population. And being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of a new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. What does Malthus say? Human population grows geometrically. Food supply grows arithmetically. Population growth will always overpower food growth. Perpetual hunger, disease, struggle. Darwin's dining companion, Harriet Martineau, was the Whig Party's poor law propagandist. Her Malthusian pamphlets had been sent to Darwin on the Beagle. The Whigs had passed a Malthusian poor law in 1834, incarcerating paupers in workhouses, separating men from women to stop breeding. Darwin realizes population explosions lead to struggle for resources. Competition weeds out the unfit. He applies this to nature. Overpopulated nature experiences fierce struggle. From chance variations, good and bad, the best, the surviving one of 10,000 trials wins, endures, passes on improved traits. He calls this natural selection. His notebook entry for September 28th. We ought to be far from wondering of changes in numbers of species from small changes in nature of locality. Even the energetic language of Decandolle does not convey the warring of the species as inference from Malthus. Increase of brutes must be prevented solely by positive checks, accepting that famine may stop desire. In nature, production does not increase whilst no check prevail, but the positive check of famine and consequently death. He develops the wedge analogy. There is a force like 100,000 wedges trying to force every kind of adapted structure into the gaps in the economy of nature, or rather forming gaps by thrusting out weaker ones. October 1838 to July 1839. Notebook D. Then Notebook E. Darwin formulates natural selection precisely. Notebook E, page 58, written in late 1838 or early 1839. Historian David Cohn identifies this as Darwin's pithy formulation. 3 principles will account for all without 1. Grandchildren like grandfathers. 2. A tendency to small change, especially with physical change. 3. Great fertility in proportion to support of parents. Heredity. Variation, Malthusian overproduction, natural selection, though he will not use that exact term until 1842. From 1837 to 1839, Darwin fills 4 transmutation notebooks, B, C, D, E, E. By late 1839, he has his theory, but he does not publish. Why? Many theories. Fear of religious persecution, fear of social disgrace, concern about upsetting his clergyman friends, his pious wife Emma, his chronic illness causing delays, his embarrassment over being wrong about Glen Roy, desire to be certain, but recent historians argue there is no evidence of a delay. Darwin did not avoid publishing. He worked steadily. He said so himself on page 1 of Origin of Species. I began work on this subject in 1837, drew up some short notes in 1842, enlarged these in 1844. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. What does Darwin do next? He gathers evidence. Mountains of evidence. He needs to answer every objection before going public. January 1842. Darwin tentatively describes his ideas in a letter to Lyell. Then in June 1842, he writes a pencil sketch. 35 pages. This is where he first coins the term natural selection. On manuscript page 5, he crosses out means of selection and writes above it natural selection. A new scientific term is born. He includes instructions to his wife Emma, publish this if I die suddenly. 1844. Darwin expands the sketch into an essay, a 189-page draft. He has it copied by an assistant to produce a 230-page fair copy. He may have intended to publish it. He does not. Instead, he revises and annotates. His wife Emma reads it. Botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker reads it in January 1847. Hooker becomes one of Darwin's closest confidants. But before showing it to Hooker, Darwin makes a choice. He needs credibility. He needs to prove himself as a serious naturalist, not just a theorist. He remembers Mr. Arthrobolanus, the tiny barnacle from Chile. He decides to spend a month describing it properly. Then he can return to his species work. 1846, Darwin begins the barnacle project. He needs to know how Mr. Arthrobolanus differs from other barnacles. He writes to museums requesting specimens. Boxes begin arriving. He quickly realizes existing barnacle classification is chaotic. Barnacles had been classified as mollusks. Then in 1830, John Vaughan Thompson showed they are crustaceans through studying their larval stages. The field needs systematic reclassification. Darwin realizes he must reclassify everything himself. He writes more letters, more boxes, smelly. Dead barnacles pile up in his study at Down House in Kent, where he moved with Emma in 1842. The project spirals. Word spreads among barnacle enthusiasts. Darwin is flooded with specimens from around the world. 1 month becomes 1 year becomes 8 years. 1846 to 1854. Every morning Darwin sits at his microscope, dissecting, measuring, comparing, drawing. His health is terrible. Mysterious illness. He estimates he loses 2 years of working time to sickness during the 8-year barnacle ordeal. His children grow up seeing nothing but barnacle work. 4 of his children are younger than 7 when he finishes in 1854, which means they never knew him to do anything else. One son visits a friend and asks, where does he do his barnacles? The boy assumes all fathers dissect barnacles. Darwin's frustration builds. He writes to Hooker, my cirripedal task is an eternal one. I make no perceptible progress. I groan under my task. Later, confound and exterminate the whole tribe. I can see no end to my work. Another time, I hate a barnacle as no man ever did before, not even a sailor in a slow-moving ship. He fears dying before completing his species work, but the barnacles yield treasure. Darwin finds extraordinary variation among barnacle species. His early theory worried about uniformity. If barnacles A, B, and C are identical, natural selection cannot distinguish between them. Survival becomes pure luck. But Darwin finds massive variation everywhere he looks. Different shell structures, different attachment methods, different reproductive strategies. Variation is the fuel for natural selection. He discovers something remarkable in Cryptophilus minutus, his Mr. arthrobalanus. This species has separate sexes. The female is large, the male is microscopic, nothing but a sperm-producing parasite attached to the female. Then Darwin finds another barnacle species with no females at all. Half the individuals are hermaphrodites, half are dwarf males, males transitioning toward becoming mere ticks, a missing link between hermaphrodites and fully sexed organisms. Down among his barnacles, he sees evolution in action. From 1851 to 1855, Darwin publishes 4 monographs on barnacles, 2 on living species, published 1852 and 1854, 2 on fossils, published 1851 and 1855. The work establishes him as a major figure in British zoology. In 1853, he receives the Royal Medal of the Royal Society of London, largely based on his first barnacle volume. His geological publications already proved his merit. Now his zoological credentials are impeccable. When he publishes his controversial species theory, his reputation will protect him from being dismissed as a crackpot. September 1854. The last barnacle monograph is ready. Darwin turns his full attention to species questions. He freely discusses his intention to write a book. He goes over previous notes. He began sorting notes for species theory. He establishes portfolios. Origin Portfolio 1, Origin Portfolio 2. 4,700 loose notes of varying length organized by topic. May 1856, Darwin takes pen to paper and begins writing Natural Selection, the Big Species Book. 9 thick volumes will survive, published posthumously in 1975. This is not Origin of Species. This is the massive treatise he plans, comprehensive, exhaustive, addressing every objection. But then, June 18, 1858, a letter arrives from Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace is in Borneo. The letter encloses 20 pages describing an evolutionary mechanism nearly identical to Darwin's natural selection. Wallace asks Darwin to forward it to Lyell if Darwin thinks it worthwhile. Darwin is shaken. He writes to Lyell, "Your words have come true with a vengeance, forestalled." I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. Even his terms now stand as heads of my chapters, so all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. The timing is catastrophic. 5 days after receiving Wallace's letter, Darwin's baby son Charles Waring comes down with scarlet fever. June 28, 1858, baby Charles dies. Darwin is prostrated with grief. But Lyell and Hooker are council members of the Linnean Society. They arrange a joint presentation, July 1st, 1858. Papers by Wallace and Darwin titled On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties and On the Perpetuation of Varieties in Species by Natural Means of Selection are read to the Society. Wallace's essay, Darwin's 1844 essay excerpts, Darwin's 1857 letter to American botanist Asa Gray outlining natural selection. The presentation draws little reaction. The Linnean Society president remarks in May 1859 that the year has not been marked by any revolutionary discoveries. Professor Samuel Houghton of Dublin claims all that was new in them was false, and what was true was old. But Darwin is spurred. He must publish, not the big book, an abstract. He writes frantically for 13 months. Ill health dogs him, but friends encourage constantly. Lyell persuades his publisher, John Murray, to take the book Sight Unseen at a generous price. November 24th, 1859. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life, is published. First edition, 1,250 copies. The book sells out immediately. Second edition, 3,000 copies, published January 7th, 1860. The book is revolution, wrapped in gentleman's prose. Darwin presents evidence accumulated over 22 years. Fossils from South America, Galapagos, mockingbirds and tortoises, barnacle variation, pigeon breeding, seed dispersal experiments. He shows how natural selection explains adaptation and diversification, small inherited variations, struggle for existence, differential survival, gradual change over immense time, common descent, the branching tree of life. Darwin predicts the existence of a moth with a proboscis long enough to pollinate an orchid with a 16-inch nectary. The moth xanthopan is discovered in Madagascar in 1903. 44 years after Origin was published, confirmation, reaction is mixed. Many reviewers do not understand the theory. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce writes a hostile review in Quarterly Review in 1860, but Darwin must be taken seriously. His reputation as geologist and zoologist is solid. There is less controversy than greeted the 1844 publication Vestiges of Creation, which had been rejected by scientists, but influenced public belief that nature operates by natural laws. What did Darwin gain by working 20 years before publishing? 3 things. First, vastly more detail in illustration and inference. Origin of Species cites hundreds of specific cases, exact locations, named organisms, measured variations. The barnacle work alone gave him intimate knowledge of how an entire group varies. Second, an extended compositional process resulting in extraordinary density, coherence, and clarity. Origin is one long argument, as Darwin called it. Every chapter builds, every objection anticipated. Third, confidence. When critics attacked, Darwin stood on a mountain of evidence. But here's what almost nobody knows. The real process Darwin went through was not about caution or fear. It was about obsession with thoroughness. Look at his working method. From 1854 onward, after barnacles, he creates a system. Portfolios of notes organized by question. Does natural selection explain instinct? Portfolio. Does it explain sterility of hybrids? Portfolio. Does it explain the fossil record? Portfolio. For each question, he gathers facts from literature. Correspondence, an experiment. Take seed dispersal. How do plant species reach oceanic islands? Darwin suspects seeds float. He tests it. He soaks seeds in salt water. He floats them in tanks for weeks, records which species survive, how long they float. Then he plants them to see if they germinate. He calculates ocean current speeds, distances seeds could travel. He publishes results before Origin, real experiments answering real objections, or pigeon breeding. Darwin wants to understand artificial selection to explain natural selection by analogy. He joins pigeon fancy clubs. He breeds pigeons at Down House. He measures every bone in different breeds, skull shapes, wing lengths, beak dimensions. He shows domestic pigeons descended from one wild species, the rock dove, but variation through selection produced breeds as different as pouters, fantails, and tumblers. If human selection produces such change in generations, imagine natural selection over millions of years. He fills notebooks with questions and experiments from 1839 to mid-1840s. 3 different experiment notebooks survive. He records every trial, every measurement, every specimen dissected. When he writes Origin, he can cite specific facts from personal investigation, not just literature. The breakthrough was not sudden. The process was accumulation. He returned from the Beagle in October 1836 with a question, do species change? By March 1837, he believed yes. By September 1838, he had the mechanism, natural selection. But mechanism is not proof. He needed to show natural selection explains the patterns he observed. Geographic distribution, fossil succession, embryology, morphology, instinct, classification, hybrid sterility. He needed to answer objections. Where are transitional fossils? How do complex organs evolve? Why are hybrids sterile? Each question required research. He spent 8 years on barnacles, partly because they provided a test case. Can he classify organisms using the principle of common descent? Yes. Do closely related species show variation? Yes. Does he find transitional forms? Yes. The hermaphrodite to dwarf male series? Does he find organs serving new functions? Yes. The cement glands homologous to ovarian tubes now serving attachment instead of reproduction. Change of function, crucial for explaining how complex organs evolve. The other key piece? Darwin studied breeders, cattle, sheep, dogs, horses, roses, pigeons. He corresponded with dozens of breeders. What variation do you see? What traits can you select? How many generations to fix a trait? He gathered facts about domestic variation to understand natural variation. If selection works artificially, it works naturally. And he made mistakes? Publicly? In 1839, he published wrong interpretations of Glenroy shorelines in Scotland. Embarrassing. He became more careful, more rigorous, more determined to get everything right before publishing the big theory. By 1858, when Wallace's letter arrived, Darwin had been working systematically on species for 21 years. He was not avoiding publication. He was building a case so comprehensive that rejection would be impossible. When forced to write quickly by Wallace's independent discovery, he produced Origin from his existing manuscript in 13 months. 13 months of writing, but 2 decades of evidence gathering. Here's the detail that changes everything. After Origin published in 1859, Darwin lived another 23 years. He published 6 major books expanding on origin themes: Orchid Pollination in 1862, Variation under Domestication in 1868, Descent of Man in 1871, Expression of Emotions in 1872, Insectivorous Plants in 1875, Different Forms of Flowers in 1877, Climbing Plants, Movement in Plants, Earthworms. Every book provided more evidence, more detail, more experiments. The process that led to Origin did not stop with Origin. It was Darwin's method: observe, question, hypothesize, test, gather evidence, refine, publish when you have overwhelming support. The man who discovered natural selection discovered it not by epiphany, but by decades of patient investigation. He saw patterns on the beagle. He formulated a mechanism reading Malthus. Then he spent 20 years proving his mechanism explained those patterns. He dissected thousands of barnacles. He drowned seeds in salt water. He measured pigeon skulls. He corresponded with hundreds of naturalists and breeders. He filled 75 notebooks and 4,700 separate notes. He wrote 4 drafts expanding from 35 pages to 490 pages. When he finally published, he had a theory harder than granite because it rested on a mountain of facts. And here's what happened next that almost nobody discusses. The real verification came after Darwin died. April 19th, 1882, Westminster Abbey, state funeral. But his theory faced decades of dispute. Many scientists accepted evolution, but doubted natural selection was the main mechanism. They proposed other mechanisms: Lamarckian inheritance of acquired traits, orthogenesis or directed evolution, saltationism or sudden jumps. Natural selection seemed too slow, too gradual, too reliant on chance variation. The fossil record remained a problem. Where are the transitional forms? The Cambrian explosion showed complex life appearing suddenly. No obvious ancestors. Paleontologists found few intermediate fossils. Owen used this against Darwin. Heredity was another problem. Darwin could not explain how traits passed to offspring. He proposed pangenesis. Particles called gemmules from every body part collect in reproductive organs. Gemmules from parents blend in offspring. But blending inheritance has a fatal flaw. Favorable variations would blend away in a few generations. Natural selection needs variance to persist. Darwin struggled with this throughout his career. He never solved it. Then, in 1866, during Darwin's lifetime, an obscure Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel published experiments on pea plants showing inheritance is particulate, not blending. Traits come in discrete units that do not blend, dominant and recessive alleles, but nobody paid attention. Mendel's work was rediscovered in 1900, 18 years after Darwin died. By 1910, geneticists had identified chromosomes as carriers of hereditary information. Genes are physical units on chromosomes. Mutations create new variants. Variants do not blend. This solved Darwin's heredity problem, but it created a new problem. Early geneticists like Hugo de Vries and William Bateson thought mutations caused evolution by sudden jumps. Big changes in one generation. New species appear instantly. This was not Darwin's gradual natural selection. Biologists split into camps. Naturalists accepted natural selection, but lacked a mechanism for heredity. Geneticists understood heredity, but rejected natural selection. The split lasted 3 decades. Then, the modern synthesis, 1930s to 1950s. Mathematicians like Ronald Fisher, J, B, S, Haldane, and Sue Allwright showed natural selection acting on small genetic variants can explain evolution. Population genetics. Small mutations accumulate. Natural selection shifts gene frequencies. Over time, populations diverge, species form. Ernst Mayr added biogeography and speciation mechanisms. George Gaylord Simpson added paleontology, showing fossil patterns match predictions. Theodosius Dobzhansky synthesized genetics and natural history in his 1937 book, Genetics and the Origin of Species. The synthesis unified biology around Darwin's natural selection combined with Mendelian genetics. Natural selection became the accepted mechanism by the 1950s, 70 years after Darwin died. Today we have DNA, Watson and Crick's 1953 discovery of the double helix structure. Genes are sequences of nucleotides, mutations are changes in DNA sequence. We can read entire genomes. Compare species gene by gene. The evidence for common descent from DNA is overwhelming. Humans share 99% of DNA with chimpanzees. All life shares core genes for basic functions. The genetic code is universal. Darwin predicted common ancestry. DNA confirms it with precision he could never imagine. And the fossil record filled in, Archaeopteryx, discovered in Germany in 1861, showed a transition between dinosaurs and birds, feathers, wings, but also teeth, bony tail, claws on wings. Since then, thousands of transitional fossils have been found. Fish to amphibians, Tiktaalik, amphibians to reptiles, Simoria, reptiles to mammals, Cynodont therapsids with progressively more mammalian features, land mammals to whales, Ambulocetus, Pachycetus showing stages of returning to water, ape-like ancestors to humans, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis. Every prediction Darwin made about transitional forms has been confirmed. The Cambrian explosion remains interesting, but is no longer mysterious. Complex life did not appear suddenly. The Ediacaran fauna precedes the Cambrian by tens of millions of years. Molecular clocks based on DNA mutation rates show animal phyla diverged gradually over hundreds of millions of years before hard shells evolved. The Cambrian explosion is an explosion of fossilization, not an explosion of origination. Shells preserve better than soft bodies. That is why Cambrian rocks show sudden diversity. So Darwin's process of discovering natural selection changed how we see reality because it established a method. Observe patterns, propose mechanisms, gather evidence, test predictions, refine, publish when overwhelming. Science. But here's the final piece almost nobody connects. Darwin's notebooks from 1837 to 1839 show him thinking not just about biology, but about mind. Notebook M, opened in July 1838, focuses on metaphysical questions. If humans evolved from apes, what does that mean for consciousness? For morality, for free will, Darwin saw the implications immediately. Natural selection applied to humans meant mental capacities evolved. No divine spark needed. Thought is a product of brain structure shaped by selection. Morality evolved because cooperative behaviors increased survival. Even religion evolved as a byproduct of brain capacities selected for other reasons. He did not publish these ideas in Origin. Too explosive. He hinted, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. But he waited 12 years after Origin to publish Descent of Man in 1871, fully applying natural selection to humans. Even then he was attacked. But the logic was inescapable. If natural selection explains all other life, it explains humans too. This changed everything about how humans see themselves. Before Darwin, humans were special creations, made in God's image, placed on Earth 6,000 years ago, given dominion over nature. After Darwin, humans are apes, evolved over millions of years, relatives of every living thing, shaped by the same forces shaping all life. Consciousness, language, morality, art, all products of a brain evolved to solve survival problems. No design needed, no purpose beyond reproduction. Meaning is what we create, not what we were given. That is why Darwin's process matters. Not just what he discovered, but how he discovered it. Patient accumulation of evidence, systematic testing, brutal honesty about difficulties, willingness to revise. 22 years from Beagle, return to Origin publication. 8 years of that spent dissecting barnacles nobody cared about. But those barnacles gave him the variation data that made natural selection convincing. The process was the discovery. And the final fact that reframes everything, in 2025, 166 years after Origin published, a study using machine learning analyzed all surviving Darwin manuscripts, letters, Darwin notebooks. Researchers at Cambridge found something nobody had noticed. Darwin's breakthrough did not happen when he read Malthus in September 1838. The notebooks show him already considering competitive struggle in July 1838. The Malthus reading gave him vocabulary and confidence, but the mechanism was forming before. The true insight came from months of slow thinking about variation, inheritance, and population pressure. Even his famous breakthrough had no single breakthrough moment. It was accretion, one thought building on another. The scientific method applied to the scientific method itself. The man who explained life practiced what he preached. Gradual change through accumulated small improvements. Natural selection shaped life. Methodical investigation shaped science. Darwin's process was his discovery. The tree of knowledge grew the same way the tree of life grew. Slowly, patiently, branch by branch. And that changes how you see reality because it shows you reality has no shortcuts. The truth does not arrive in flashes. It accumulates in notebooks filled over decades by someone willing to spend 8 years with barnacles because the barnacles hold answers. Someone willing to drown seeds in salt water for weeks to test whether they float. Someone willing to breed pigeons for years to understand variation. The process is not dramatic, it is discipline. But discipline repeated daily for decades discovers what drama cannot, how the world actually works. Darwin's grave in Westminster Abbey sits near Isaac Newton's. Two men who changed everything about how we understand reality. Newton explained gravity, Darwin explained life. Both worked in solitude for years before publishing. Both accumulated overwhelming evidence before making claims. Both faced resistance. Both were proven right by centuries of confirmation. The parallel is exact. Science progresses, not by genius alone, but by genius combined with patience. The last line in Origin of Species. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. From barnacles to beagle to breakthroughs spanning continents, from pencil sketches hidden in drawers to books that toppled humanity from the center of creation. Natural selection explained everything, because one man spent 22 years making certain that is the process, that is the discovery, that is the reality we still live in, a world where patient investigation reveals truths more profound than any quick answer. Darwin did not have an epiphany. He had a method. The method built a revolution. The revolution built modern biology. The biology explains you. That is how Darwin went through the process to understand natural selection. And it changes how you see reality, because reality rewards those who look closely, measure carefully, and refuse to publish until the evidence is mountainous. 22 years, 5,000 specimens, 4,000 notes, 8 years of barnacles, one theory that still stands, one method that still works. Cold facts, dead barnacles, living truth.